So Auburn has hired Bryan Harsin. Touched on it already, but I really want to dive into this a little bit. Here's what I want to dive into. Outsiders probably do not have a firm grasp on how significant this was. You're thinking, all right, Bryan Harsin, like that's a name that was way off the radar. Even Auburn people weren't talking about him. Great, okay, they hired him. Like, what's the big deal? Coaches have been hired before. They'll be hired after this. That's true. You need to understand the uniqueness within the Auburn sphere, within the world of just Auburn athletics and Auburn football, and then how it applies to the broader context of college football. What happened at Auburn over the past week could very well have implications that reach out and touch your program. If you're a Texas fan, if you're a USC fan, if you're a Tennessee fan, it could impact you and impact you in a positive way, hopefully. Now, there's an acronym. Once again, my Auburn listeners, my Auburn viewers, you've probably heard of the acronym. It's JABA. It's JABA. It's just Auburn being Auburn. And that's something that the locals use to describe when things are being bungled and you can see it happening a mile away. And they don't like it, but they also know historically they've really had no control over it. And so they just roll their eyes. Here we go again. That's essentially the attitude. Here we go again. That was in the process of being put in motion. And then you, Auburn fans, and Alan Green changed all that, the athletic director there. When you're told that things are hurting college football, do you listen to that? Because you've heard it a lot lately. It's mainly in the context of the college football playoff. Like, there are a lot of people out there who want you to believe the playoff is hurting college football because the playoff has given a rise to the haves and a widening between the gap of the haves and the have-nots. And there are a lot of things that you're told are hurting the sport that I don't really believe are hurting the sport nearly as much as just general incompetence is hurting the sport. I'll give you an example. I'm not a believer that the college football playoff hurts college football nearly as much as garbage targeting rules hurt college football. I'm not a believer the playoff hurts college football nearly as much as coverage of the college football playoff. If I could just adjust the way the thing's covered, I think we would do away with a lot of the problem you have with it. I've already made that point. That's another video. You can find it on the channel. But now let me circle it back around to Auburn. Here is one of the big problems that exist and have and will continue to exist in the world of college football. And that is non-football people making football decisions. The very lifeblood of this sport is money. You have to have it. You have to have it to survive, to build those fancy facilities, to have these staffs, and to be able to pay these staffs. You got to have money. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Federal government's not giving you grant money to run your football program. And so a lot of times it's private donations. And unfortunately, those donations come with earmarks, and those earmarks say access. That's the kind of earmark that normally comes along with those checks. And it creates this culture where you got a lot of people who have rightly made their fortunes in other areas where they have some expertise in most cases, thinking that that makes them an expert in football matters, basketball matters, whatever the case may be. And it's this weird situation where you would never see a football coach walk into a bank or a car dealership and just start calling the shots. But yet you got folks who own tons of car dealerships or who are, multimillionaires from the banking world. They will gladly walk into an athletic department and start thinking they deserve to call the shots about who's going to be hired to run a football program. It's the craziest thing in the world. So Kevin Steele, the Auburn defensive coordinator, was well on his way to getting this job because of just that mechanism being put in place. John Talty with AL.com, I think, did a really good job summarizing what was happening behind the scenes. And I talked about a lot of what he put in his report on Late Kick. I was detailing that. I told you about Steele. That was in motion. Like, there are two things that could be true here, guys. That could have been in motion, and then it could have also been derailed. And there is no doubt in my mind that the athletic director there, Alan Green, let it be known, another word for that is leaked, that Kevin Steele was in line to be the head coach. There was a major push behind the scenes by the kinds of characters that we're talking about right now to make Kevin Steele the head coach, just elevate him to the job. And Auburn fans, I firmly believe, changed the course of history for that program. And then the president there, Jay Goose, stepped in and he kind of stamped legitimacy onto this thing. When he backed Alan Green, and Alan Green said, I don't like the way it's going here. I got your backing. All right, we're going to have an actual coaching search. That is why, in a nutshell, so many Auburn fans are already in love with Bryan Harsin. Like, you got folks who didn't know who he was 2 weeks ago that love him right now. Well, he's not yet coached a football game. He's not yet landed a recruit. How could you love him? Here's why they love him. And here's why it could pertain to your program, even if you're not an Auburn fan. They love him because they know for the first time in quite likely their lifetimes, they directly contributed. It's almost like they made the hire. And it's not that they made sure he got hired, it's they made sure someone else's choice didn't get hired. Whereas in the past, it would have been Kevin Steele, and they would have looked around and said, I don't like it, but there's not much I can do about it. Well, now they did something about it, and that's why they love Bryan Harsin already. And in the past, they would have gotten a result in spite of what they wanted. Now they got a result because of what they wanted. Now that's a catch-22 sometimes, because Tennessee fans pulled this with Greg Schiano and got Jeremy Pruitt instead. I'm not so sure if you look at that proposition right now, it makes a ton of sense for Tennessee. So you got to be careful with that. But that kind of brings us full circle now. What does this have to do with your program? Well, I'm telling you right now, it could be Tennessee, or it could be Texas, or it could be Southern Cal. How many people are watching what's happening in Auburn here? How many people watched a very entrenched culture here get turned on its ear and have an actual football search by, for all accounts around Auburn, an outsider? Alan Green's not an Auburn guy. He didn't play for Auburn. He didn't grow up in Auburn. He's an outsider. But yet he came in, he's in the athletic director spot, and he actually played the role of athletic director, which is painfully rare in these situations in the South sometimes, at Auburn no less. So if I'm watching that in Texas, if I'm watching that at Southern Cal or Tennessee, I'm taking notes. Because here's what we got to ask ourselves. Is it going to cost you something? Most of the time, people in at least nameplate power positions, they kind of cave under pressure here. And they do it because they think it's going to cost them. We can't afford to alienate Booster X, Donor Y, and we can't do it because we need their money. I got you. And listen, this is going to cost Auburn. You better believe it's going to cost Auburn some money. In the short term, it will. Winning cures a lot of that in the long term, but let me ask you this. Independent of what Bryan Harsin ever does on the field, I'll talk about that in a second, independent of that, what are those resources worth if the earmarks attached to those resources lead to really handcuffed programs? Auburn in particular right now. What does it really matter? It doesn't. It doesn't matter how. If you're printing money, but you're using it to run your program into the ground, then the money's not really worth anything. No one cares. So I don't know how Bryan Harsin's going to do here. Bryan Harsin, for all I know, is not going to work out great as Auburn head coach. But I'm telling you right now, if you keep the blueprint in place that you use to hire him, eventually they'll get it right at Auburn. Now, for their sake, I hope they got it right here, which leads me to this final point I wanted to address. And that's a lot of folks I was hearing from that said things like, well, he has no SEC ties. He's never recruited down here. He doesn't know the lay of the land. Listen, there are examples historically of guys who came in this conference. Nick Saban had never darkened a door in the South before he did. And then he won national championships at LSU and eventually Alabama. A guy named Urban Meyer. I mean, what kind of pedigree did he have in the South? He had been, Bowling Green in Utah. The bottom line is those are two generational coaches. I'm not comparing Harsin to that. What I'm saying is if the guy is legit, he's legit. If he's the real deal, he's the real deal. And he'll come in here and he'll develop relationships and he'll build a staff that knows how to attack the recruiting trail and understands the JUCO circuit and understands the high school contacts and the networking you have to do. He understands how to play the game. He understands how to coach the game. And if you got that in your back pocket, there is this crazy ability that coaches have to adapt. It's what they've done. It's what they do. It's in their blood. They do it their whole careers. If he's the real deal, he'll succeed down here. And if he doesn't, then he won't. But I can tell you right now, if Bryan Harsin fails at Auburn, I don't think it's going to be because, as one person put it, oh, he's done nothing but face Hawaii and Wyoming every year. Like he would never win down here. Well, I got news for you, brother. He gets to play with a team that's got a little bit better roster than the one he played with at Boise. All due respect there. You play in the South, you get to recruit in the South. That's why it never made sense to me, these people arguing Boise would never win the SEC. Well, Boise would never be in the SEC because you're in Florida and Georgia and Alabama and they're in Idaho. Like if you put them in the SEC, they'd get to recruit Southern talent. So now Bryan Harsin's going to get to do that. So it remains to be seen. Again, I am almost fired up for it, independent of my expectations for him on the field. Like, I've got questions just like you do, but the bottom lines are Auburn hired a legitimate football coach. They went outside the culture to do it, and I hope it pays off for him, because if it does, it'll kind of push what I hope will be a trend over the next 10 years of getting football-minded people in the room, more so than just hangers-on in the room to make these decisions. Like in the NFL, you have got football people hopefully making personnel decisions. In the college football world, you got dudes and you got ladies from all over the place that have no background in football whose pocketbooks allow them to make decisions. And that's why so many programs are horribly mismanaged right now. And that's why you got a few elites that figured out how to run it the right way. And you got a bunch of others that should be elite that aren't. But instead of taking personal responsibility, instead they just want to tell you, oh, the system's broken. The system's what's holding us down. No, allowing clowns to make football decisions because of what they're worth, that is what's holding you down a whole lot more than any system has ever held you down.